All right, CNT125, our lab orientation to get us up and going in the lab room for the semester. What you're looking at here is a student lab station. On the table are two Windows PCs that we'll be using for completing our labs. The password for these will be CNT class, all lowercase, basically all one word. That'll get us into the desktop that we can use for our labs. Off to the left of our lab station, in this case, we have our equipment rack that we'll be using for our labs. Let's take a look at what we have here. We actually have a set of routers and switches up top for a lab station to use, and we have a pretty much duplicate set of routers and switches on the bottom for a lab station to use. What you'll notice is some of the lab equipment is facing one direction, some of the lab equipment is facing the other direction. As you look at the lab station, the equipment that has most of the ports facing, this way, so to speak, is for the students on this side. The set of equipment, in this case on the bottom, with all the really important ports facing the other way, is for the other side of the lab station. Now, as you sit down, just to help you orient, in the corner of the lab table up here in the corner, there's a sticker that tells you what half of the rack to use. In this case, on this lab station, in the corner here it says use top equipment. That's equipment up here. All the really important ports are facing the users over here. On the other side of the table, there's a sticker in the corner that says use bottom equipment, which would mean the bottom half of the rack. All the really important switch ports and router ports are facing that way for them to use. As I look at the equipment rack, there is a panel in the middle that has a bunch of outlet boxes. You'll find in most cases there'll be like 2 to 3 outlet boxes. One outlet box has the connection to the college network or the internet, if you will. That's the one, more times than not, when we're done, we're going to make sure our PCs are back into. These lab station PCs are plugged back into. So we have connection to the college network, D2L, that sort of things for submitting labs. The other outlet box in here is connection to our room network, which is at the side of the lab room. We might use this for some labs, but other classes might be using this for labs as well. When we're done, we normally do not want to leave the cables in this room network box. We'll make sure they get back to the internet box. When you come in, if they're in this room network box, more than likely you'll need to move them to the internet box to get connection to MyHack, D2L, etc. So look for that to make sure cables are getting back in there or in there when you need any kind of internet connection. The other box over here is for our cabling students to cable up their lab network connections, the 140 class. Right below this panel will be 2 power strips. The top power strip here should have all the router and switch power cords plugged into it. So if I were to turn this top power strip on, all the router and switches on the top half of the rack would turn on. The bottom power strip should have all the router and switch power cords from the bottom half of the rack plugged into that. Again, if I turn that power strip on, it should turn on all of those routers and switches. So as you come in for lab, you may need to turn on one or both power strips, one for the top, one for the bottom kind of thing. There is our basic lab setup. As we start hooking up networks in the lab room, we are going to need a couple cables. Off to the side of the lab room will be a room network rack. On that rack are hanging black patch cables. These are straight through cables, and these guys right here. These are straight through cables that are used for connecting unlike devices. In addition, on this room network rack are some orange patch cables. Here's a couple orange patch cables right here. These orange patch cables are crossover cables for connecting like devices, so switch to switch, router to router kind of thing. If I swivel my camera around a little bit, we'll see right here to my side is the room network rack, where I do actually have some patch cables here, black patch cables and orange patch cables for hooking up our networks. When we're done hooking up our networks, we'll need to make sure those cables get back to that lab room network rack, if you will. But that's where we'll get our patch cables for hooking up our routers and switches that are here. In addition, we will need a console cable for connecting our workstation to switch or router kind of thing. The console cables are stored in a cabinet on one of the walls of our lab room. On In the 101 lab room, it's on the far wall. On the 103 lab room, again, it's on the far wall as you come in the room. Our blue console cables, let me get mine. I have it set off to the side here. Here is our blue console cable, just like we were doing in Packet Tracer. This console cable will need to get connected to the serial port on the back of your student PC. If I'm going to try to carefully swivel this guy around a little bit. On the back of our student PC, down towards the bottom is a serial port. It's over here near the display port cable. I'll take the serial port adapter, plug it into there. And I might want to give it just a twist or two just to hold it in place. And then the other end of the console cable has the RJ45 connection on. I will need to use that to console into my appropriate router and switch. As I look at my routers and switches up here, the switches, console ports would be on the back. This router, console port's on the back. This router, console port is on the front. It's even labeled blue console. There would be my router console connection for this router. And then these switches up top, console connections in the back. So I'm going to need to look for, let's say I'm going to console into these top switches. I'm going to need to run my console cable through the rack, look for the appropriate switch, top, bottom, whatever, and look for that console port. And these are on the far left, and plug it in. And that'll get me my console connection for my lab connection, lab configuration. So there is a quick orientation to our lab stations and our lab rooms. Pretty much every table in the room is set up in a similar fashion, whether it be the 101 or the 103 lab room. Look for those clues, the stickers on the table, and your equipment ports facing you to know which setup you're using for the semester.